Hey, so this was a video I knew I wanted to make, but it's not really a video I entirely understood how to make. I originally wanted to make a script just to make sure I didn't miss any important pieces of information. Um, but I just don't feel like I can draw up a huge script and make a video on it in a short amount of time, so I guess I'll just do this unscripted. So, I grew up uh, somewhat normally to start out with. I had a mom and a dad and one older brother. My dad, I don't know what his religious beliefs were way back then, when I was really young. And my mom, I don't really know what her religious beliefs are to this day. She has mentioned Jesus before, but she's also said some things that I felt were kind of esoteric throughout my life. So I don't really know what she believes. My grandmother, on the other hand, was a very traditional Methodist. I could compare her to Toriel in a few ways. She would play piano at a local Methodist church. And, she'd take us to church every Sunday, me and my older brother. Um, and, we went to Sunday school, we watched Veggie Tales, and the thing is that when I was that young, it was kind of hard for me to take in information. And this has kind of always been a thing. It took me a few years before I could follow like the plot of an episode of like a cartoon or something. When I was very young, it was somewhat hard for me to take in information, like to absorb it. And so when I was that young, I guess I just didn't understand religion to the best of my ability. I think one of the concepts that I kind of wish uh, I understood a lot better at that age was when I was that young, I did not understand the concept of the Trinity. When I was that young, I just kind of understood it that there was one God, and then Jesus was his son, and he was a human. And then I guess kid me just didn't hear about the Holy Spirit a lot, so I didn't know what to do with that information. And so I guess growing up, when I was super young, I believed that there was a God. However, I did not have the correct interpretation of God, I guess you could say. It was more comparable to believing in a generic deity that exists rather than the God of Christianity. And this was simply just due to my own limited mind and how I couldn't understand these concepts. Uh, but there was something interesting about going to church. I always felt something when I went to church. Um, it's hard to describe, but when I went to church, I sort of felt like there was something there physically. Uh, I felt a presence of someone. At the time, I guess I wouldn't have understood it as a personal force, but I felt a presence there. And that presence always filled me with emotion. Uh, Whether that emotion be nostalgia sometimes, or Whether that be joy or whether that be um, a longing for something I didn't know, I always kind of understood that there was a presence in that building. I couldn't really explain that, but it's not something I thought about a whole lot until I was older. Uh, as I grew up, when I was like a toddler, I think I was a big fan of Veggie Tales and Thomas the Tank Engine, so we grew up with these basic lessons about morality and stuff like that. Uh, but I think it was in my elementary school years. It was really when I started going to school that things got a lot harder for me. The environment of a school was a little overwhelming to me. It was hard for me to take in information, so taking in the information from like a teacher trying to teach us stuff, it was hard for me to distinguish the difference between numbers and digits right away. A number is like the whole thing. A digit is like the little numbers within the big number. So like 27 is a number composed of the digits 2 and 7. And so like for a few of the basic math problems starting out, that was something that got in my way a little bit. It was a little bit hard to understand. Um but I eventually did figure that out and got to be actually kind of good at math. If I can brag a little bit. Um, okay, but I'm lying a little bit as well, so we'll get to that. Um, so that was one problem, but I think the big problem was, and here's the thing, there are different types of autism. There's high functioning autism and low functioning autism. So there are people who can do really well with their autism and they might just have like a fixation on something, or they might have like social anxiety a little bit. But then there's the type of autism which genuinely makes it so that you can't do the same things everyone else can do. And it looks like you should be able to. You've got two arms, two legs, you've got a brain, you've got all your body is in order, but there are just some things that you just can't do, as if there's like a barrier to doing them. Um, and so I kind of grew up with that type of autism where I was just not able to do certain things that other people can do. Um, Now, I'd say probably one of my biggest problems growing up. I'm not going to mention all my autism tics because there's many of them, and to be honest, I have not kept track of all of them. I just know them when they come up. I'd say probably my biggest autism tic throughout my life was my aversion to certain noises. So, uh, in my mind, it would be if there was a sharp noise. If a noise is sharp, then I would have to do something about it. If a noise is sharp, it would make my body itch. Uh, and I would have to do something to stop that itch. That sounds a little bit weird, but in a sense it's like I could physically feel my nervous system. So my nervous system sensed the sharp noise. It processed it through my brain, and then like a certain area of my body would just itch. And it started out that I would just like physically scratch the itch, right? But then I found out that there are other things I could do which could essentially stop itching, even without like physically scratching my body. So like it started out with me itching my own legs, but then eventually I got to the point where I would sort of put my left ear to my left shoulder and sort of simulate the feeling of an ear closing. Um, my parents and caretakers and stuff, they would call these tics rituals. And I never really liked using the term rituals because you make it sound, I don't know, you make it sound like a religion or something. But they would always use the term rituals for them. Um, and throughout my life, these rituals have been varying degrees of intrusive, I guess. So like my first few years of elementary school, I was able to get along a little bit fine, although I did occasionally have an outburst. I would occasionally like yell if a problem was too confusing to me, or I didn't understand the way someone was explaining something. I did have outbursts in those first few years that the other kids just weren't having. Um, so I think it was in my elementary school years. I think it was about when I was 9. I think one of the big changing points in my life was that my parents got a divorce. This was a big changing point in my life. I think it was about when I was in 4th grade. I think my parents got a divorce. Um, so I don't know the reason they got a divorce, but essentially, my mom stayed in like our hometown, so it's like I lived with my mom, and then I would have to go visit my dad every other weekend. Um, that would sort of take away half my weekends, in a sense, and I don't know, these weird feelings of physically feeling my nervous system. Sometime after the divorce, it felt like my nerves were processing that so much to the point where my functionality completely broke down, in a sense. I was having outbursts more than ever. I was doing my autism tics, and they were very disruptive to the kids around me. Eventually, I had to be put in the resource room. I became a special eds kid, and I had to spend my days in the resource room. With the resource room, uh, the teachers will teach you a little bit and then kind of make you do the work on your own. It's it's like in normal classes you have a fairly even amount of teaching and working. In the resource room, they do very minimal teaching and then kind of let you figure a few things out. But you know what? That system actually did kind of work out for me. No, I wasn't disrupting the other kids. Um, and I was doing my work, of course. Uh, it was kind of like it kind of got me used to the feeling of working on my own. Working without someone else trying to butt in and uh, help me in a way that just didn't actually help me. But it was still kind of rough. I felt like an outsider. I felt like a outcast. And there were other things that at that age would bother me. For example, um, wearing sweatpants was hard for me at that age because I felt like sweatpants were very itchy, and I just could not do jeans. I could not wear jeans at all. I could not do that. And so I wanted to wear shorts a lot, But my mother sort of made me wear long pants as much as possible. But it just did not feel comfortable at all. It just did not. Sometime after the divorce, I got into watching Family Guy. Uh, I was I was still in elementary school, so that was a little bit early to be watching Family Guy. Um, and I learned a whole bunch about a lot of concepts that I probably should have found out from somewhere other than Family Guy. So, like, I learned about sex from Family Guy. Maybe not a good place to learn about it. I'm still coitophobic to this day. Uh, and I sort of learned about atheism from Family Guy. I sort of learned about the idea that some people just do not believe that there is a God. And before this point, I've gone to church and stuff, but I guess I sort of was agnostic up till that point. Um, and so around that time, like I didn't necessarily become an atheist. I'd say I more so became agnostic. The sort of I don't know if God is real. And I sort of leaned more towards the idea of no, probably not. That was sort of the idea I leaned more towards. Uh, and as I leaned more into that idea, I had to go into middle school. Now, middle school was kind of where my life went to shit. My autism was getting worse and worse, and I was having more and more outbursts. I spent time in like one resource room, which was kind of like an open floor plan. And that worked out for basically a day. Like a few, I'd say like a few months into being in that one resource room, I had so many outbursts that I eventually had to move to a different resource room, which is essentially an even more isolated resource room. It had like sort of a quiet room off to the side. And I was essentially the most autistic person in school. So the only way I could be in school and do my work was if I used the quiet room. Uh Now I do have to start to mention the really bad outbursts I've had throughout my life. In elementary school, we were doing PE. And we were playing like the simulated version of baseball. We didn't use an actual baseball because we were so young, but we played like the sort of simulation of baseball. Uh, but whenever you don't make it to a base in time or like something like that, the teacher or one of the other kids will say you're out. And in my young, like elementary school age autistic mind, I took you're out to be an insult. Like they were making fun of you for failing at the game. And so like I told people and like I yelled at people sometimes to stop using that word because that word just felt like an insult to me. And one kid said that, and at that point I think I've heard it so much that I was just fed up with it, so I shoved her. And I pushed her pretty hard. I That's a moment I look back on a lot and I regret. I was grounded for that, certainly, and my mom was a correction officer at the time, so she kind of knew how to ground someone at that point. She essentially locked me in the bathroom that night, and just to simulate the feeling of a prison cell, and I just I just didn't like that. I deserved it, but I didn't like it. And I'd say like one of the pivotal outbursts I had. This was one when I was in middle school, and it was kind of like I was trying to do my work, and my teacher kept telling me, "Hey, it's free time. You should go hang out with the other students. You should go like spend some time with them." Um, they had this like designated time during the day, which was dedicated to trying to get all the kids to like socialize with each other. And every time the teacher would come in, I would say no. I'm busy. I'm doing work. Sometimes I'd use that free time to like play with the Lego that they had in the room. They had a few. They had like a few Legos in the resource room that I could play with if I wanted to, and so sometimes I would use that time to play with Lego. Other times I would use it to just continue working, but I never wanted to go out and spend time with the other kids. I never wanted to do that. I felt like it was a waste of time. I felt like I was in this building to get good grades and come home. That was what I was in this building to do. Well, there was one time where she came in and she asked me if I wanted to hang out with the other kids, and it was another moment where I got fed up with hearing that so much that I ended up slapping her. This was back when I was in middle school, and so my punishment for that was that I had to go to a hospital in Omaha and spend some time in the ER. So, while I was in this ER, there were some of the expectations that were in school around that time. Uh, Essentially, in order to get out of there, in order to get out of the ER, you were required to spend a little bit of time every day socializing with the other kids. Like going out to like this big sort of open cafeteria area out there and sort of spending some time socializing with the other kids. And so I only really did it because I was forced to. I only really went out there because I was forced to. Um, and, to be honest, I didn't even really make any friends out there. I just kind of went out and listened to what was going on out there. Interestingly enough, I don't know if the hospital was allowed to do this. I don't know if the hospital was allowed to do this. But the hospital, like one of the hospital workers, told us about God. I don't remember what the message was exactly. I more so remember one of the other kids making a whole bunch of crass jokes about it. But I did remember that very distinctly. And they were probably talking about the idea of a generic God. They probably weren't talking about Christianity specifically. But that did kind of resonate with me. I was a little bit interested. Now our dad, our father, after the divorce, he moved away. He moved to like his hometown from before he met my mom. And he met a woman, and the two of them went to church every Sunday. And so me and my brother, we were kind of like, the age of um, middle school. I was in the age of a middle schooler. My brother was like the age of a high schooler. And he took us to church with him around that time. Um, and so I just kind of went there and like just kind of waited for church to be over in those days. But after that day in the hospital, I was like, maybe I should pay attention to this church stuff. Maybe there is something to this. And so, whenever Dad would take us to church again, I would pay attention. I would listen. I was the type of kid who grew up not understanding anything. I did not understand how the noises which bothered me were seemingly fine to other people. I did not understand a lot of things, and it would always take me like an embarrassingly long time to absorb information. And so, being told that there is someone, a power in this universe that is capable of understanding these mysteries, these riddles, these enigmas of life that I had to face on an everyday basis, and that this being not only understood those things, but was able to interact with me in a non intrusive way. He was able to interact with me in a way that didn't confuse me more or make things worse. In a sense, I felt like this being could help me understand certain things that were just enigmas in my life. And so at that point I was like, okay, I am going to believe in this being. I am going to find out more about this being. And I am going to trust this being. Because at the time I was very agnostic, and I even believed in the idea that God might be real. But I think it was particularly knowing that he was knowing. He was knowing of the things I wasn't. That was what made me happy. Now, in regards to some differences between the way, like, a little toddler version of me viewed Christianity and the way I started to understand it in, like, my middle school years, and this isn't even saying anything about the church itself, this is just stuff I, like, absorb from pop culture most of the time. When I was a little toddler, I did not know about the Trinity. Or, well, I might have known about the Trinity, but just didn't understand. When I was in the middle school age, I understood that, in a sense, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all God, and all one with each other, in a way that I had to accept that I didn't understand, but that this was the nature of the being I was worshiping. I didn't have to understand this integral unity, I just needed to understand that he was an integral unity. Another incorrect belief I had when I was a kid was I sort of believed in works salvation. I believed that good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. And since I was a bad kid, I was most likely going to go to hell. However, the churches that my dad went to, he was very particular about finding churches that believed in faith alone salvation. Which, if you read the Bible, is the true biblical version of salvation. The idea that God wants to save everyone, and he offers salvation as a gift. A gift that you essentially just have to receive by believing it's real. And that's simple enough. I mean, like, a broken person like me who has hit teachers and shoved other kids, you know, it's like, if work salvation were real, I would never be able to make up for that. I would never be able to make up for the thoughts of doing that, because even if I can control myself in the future, I'm still going to have sinful thoughts. And so, I grew to believe in this being that I didn't fully understand. And in a sense, I kind of understood what that emotional presence I felt at church was when I was a kid. At the time, I didn't understand. But as an adult, finding out about, well, not as an adult, but a sort of teenager, middle school, finding out about the Holy Spirit and how God is present within a church building. Uh, he's not just like at the top of creation overlooking everything. He's also physically inside the church building. That was interesting. It was a connection that, before that point, I hadn't been able to make. I just thought, oh, well, church gives me the feels. But it sort of gave me the feels in a way that, like, a TV show or a video game or, like, spending time with family just didn't. And so, I believed in God since 2014. But I was like, if I just believe in God, He'll save me, so I'll just believe in Him and do whatever I want. So 2014 and 2015, this is sort of because 2014 was sort of the year I accepted the truth of Christianity. These years were easier than 2012 and 2013. Definitely easier. But at the same time, they weren't perfect. They weren't great. I was still dealing with a lot of baggage with my autism tics and stuff like that. When I came back from the hospital, I was able to behave a little better in middle school, but I was still pissed off every time I had to go to middle school, and, that. 2014 and 2015, I'd say, were like my last. Well, sort of the 2015 to 2016 period was sort of my last year of middle school. And that was alright. In 2014, our grandparents got us some Kindle Fire tablets. And with those Kindle Fire tablets, I was essentially able to look up YouTube whenever I want, and my brother and I really got into the Yogscast. They were like these Minecraft YouTubers at the time, so that's kind of how I got into Minecraft. And they were kind of like the only YouTubers I watched for like a long time, them or any other like Minecraft YouTuber at the time. They were the only ones I watched consistently, but I'd occasionally watch a Dan TDM video or something like that. It was Christmas of 2015. Our dad had got us laptops. The laptops and Kindles are important for the story. I'll tell you why in a minute. And with a laptop, I was able to explore much more of the internet than a simple Kindle Fire did. With a laptop, I was able to look up, anything I wanted, essentially. And I gotta itch my ear a little bit. There we go. With a laptop, I was able to explore much more of the internet than I was before. And so, I got into all sorts of things. Game theory, I got into game theory around that time. I got into Markiplier and Jacksepticeye. I'd say the two the two big video games I got into around 2016 were Five Nights at Freddy's and Undertale. And interestingly enough, Undertale does actually have a role in the story, interestingly enough. So when I was a kid, like, I would always notice Jesus parallels in media. I was a Bionicle fan when I was a kid, and so when I saw Matt Toro's sacrifice, I was like, "Oh, that's what Jesus did, essentially." But this time it's like a a robot with ice powers. I mean, that's interesting. I saw Zane do the exact same thing in Ninjago, so you know, Undertale was kind of an interesting example. And after Deltarune Chapter 4, I do think the game developer was intentionally making this game a rather simple allegory about Jesus Christ. The idea of the game is that uh, you can either like the idea of the game is that like it's an RPG game, uh, but it's an RPG game where you don't have to kill the enemies. If you want, you could like essentially solve a puzzle which sort of pacifies the enemy without fighting it. And so, as I was growing in the faith, learning about how, we're supposed to strive to live in peace with all people, and, we are not supposed to judge our neighbors. And I was also learning about how, salvation is not by being a good person, but by just accepting the free offer of mercy. This game was rather interesting in that sense. And so, like, I saw this story about, like, this kid who was going through this underground of a bunch of characters that wanted to kill them. I thought it was a girl at the time, so I almost said her, but whatever gender the kid was, just going through the underground and, like, showing mercy to all these characters that wanted them dead. And then, like, at the very end of the game, like, all these characters get out of the underground and they get to be in, like, this very bright area compared to where they were before. This place that they were essentially longing for and hoping about and wishing for. It was emotionally satisfying in a strange way. And at the time, I didn't think any of this was intentional. I thought this was all just like, these are just the parallels that media will have occasionally. It really did stick with me. It really did stick with me. Now, when I was younger and I wasn't able to pick up on nuance, of course, I kind of understood the Christian message as hard pacifism. Of course, that's not the Christian message. Sometimes you have to fight, but it was sort of a case where it's like I saw this and I was like, that reminds me of Jesus. That reminds me of Jesus. And so if 2014 was the year I got, if 2014 was the year where I started to believe in Jesus, 2016 is when I started to be proud of being a Christian. 2016 is sort of when I developed a passion for the faith. Like, yes, I am a Christian, and I am proud of it. I didn't go out and advertise that around quite yet. But it was kind of a... it was kind of the year where I decided that, God's not only real, He's my Father. I can ask Him for what I want. I remember one time, and I'm not really claiming this is a miracle or anything, but I remember one time I was sort of doubting the existence of God, like, a little bit. And, like, I walked downstairs and I was like, hey, God, if you're real, could you give me a sign? And then I looked up for my prayer and there was just, like, a big cross as, like, a decoration in my dad's house. And I mean, like, that cross was already there. it was there before I kneeled over for my prayer. But I mean, like, just immediately seeing that after my prayer was like, a young me was like, okay, that's wholesome. That's wholesome. That's not going to convince anyone else of God's existence, but that is wholesome. Um, and so I was going to church with my dad, essentially. Now, my dad, he was not the best at spreading the word. Like, I kind of feel bad bringing it up, but essentially, our dad did try to force religion on us a little bit. And whereas I, like, when I went to the hospital and I sort of had this experience where I was essentially asked to give God a chance. My brother was essentially just forced back into church at that age, which he didn't really like. I'm pretty sure my brother is an agnostic right now. I don't think he has any hostility towards the faith as much as he does our human dad. But I did get something out of our dad taking us to church, even if he made us go. I got to hear about Christian morals every day, and that was nice. I got to learn more about someone who cares about me and understands that I've made countless mistakes, but still wants to be my father anyway, and doesn't shun me as an outcast, but welcomes me into his house as essentially an adopted son. That was wholesome for me. So 2016 passed, and my human dad was a very flawed individual, and I'm not gonna bring up the event that caused this, but there was a particular event in my life where after it happened, my dad and my stepmom got a divorce, and my dad ended up going to jail until I was basically done with school. I'd say that happened in about late 2016, if I remember right. And this was sort of when I started high school. And so during high school, I was mostly back at my hometown with my mother and grandmother. Um, and I stopped going to church because I was going to church when my dad went to church. So I did stop going to church, and of course I still rooted my identity in Christianity, right? I still profess myself as a Christian, and I still believe that God was real. Um, and stuff like that. But when it came around to 2017, I guess I just didn't take the relationship as seriously as I should have. In 2016, or in 2017, sorry, in 2017, I developed a particular habit of looking up animated girls farting on each other. Uh, it was all fully clothed stuff. But it was, I don't know, at that time, I kind of felt like it was wrong. But I was doing it anyway. And a big reason it was wrong for me at that age was that I was still a teenager. And I was looking up these videos that like adults were making. I could have, if I went too far into that, I would have eventually ended up in this community with all of these adults. And maybe something would have went too far if I was at that, I was still in high school and in a community with people much older than me. It's like that could have gone wrong. Fortunately enough, nothing did go wrong. Um, I think it was towards the end of 2017. I really got into Vocaloid. I really got into Hatsune Miku. And it wasn't Christmas at the time. But for some reason, during late 2017, I felt like looking up Christian Vocaloid songs. Now, I was in the privacy and comfort of my own home, so I had nothing to be embarrassed about. But I was, like, slightly embarrassed about getting the feeling to look up Vocaloid Christian songs. So I instead looked up Vocaloid Christmas songs. And I did that way before December. I think it was, like, in September or something. And so I listened to those and stuff. And eventually, by the end of the year, I just accepted. I just accepted looking up Vocaloid Christian music, and I was like, I believe in God. I have all these fixations on, like, video games I like, where I can name every character and quote, like, half the script by heart with, like, these video games and stuff I liked. These are essentially what we call autism fixations. It's like a series that you really like. So, like, by the end of 2017, in my mind, I was like, I don't know a lot about the Bible. What if I made the Bible one of my autism fixations? What if I treated it with the same time and attention that I give to a video game I really like, or something like that? So, I think it was sometime in, like, early 2018. I did sort of treat the Bible as an autism fixation. I rewatched some VeggieTales episodes to learn about the Bible, which was interesting. And I was like, I think I should get an overview on the story, right? I should get a timeline going on. And I found out about the guy who made VeggieTales, Phil Vischer. He made another show at some point called Buck Denver something something about the Bible with Buck Denver. And it was like this puppet show with this puppet named Buck Denver. And he was like a news anchor who, like, talked about Bible stories, I guess. And essentially, this series was an overview of the entire chronological order of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And I was like, okay, if I watch this series, I'm going to get a summary on the entire story. Now, because I didn't care about sinning at that point in my life, I did decide to watch it for free from someone on YouTube who just, like, had the series and uploaded all the episodes. So I watched all the episodes online on YouTube for free without buying the thing. However, it did get me to understand that the Bible is not just a collection of stories about various people who have interacted with God in their lives. No, the Bible is one cohesive narrative. It's a narrative about how God created man, Adam and Eve, And he wanted a relationship with Adam and Eve. But he gave them free will because he wanted it to be Adam and Eve's choice to have a relationship with him. Adam and Eve chose to not have a relationship with God. They made the one decision that would get them thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But they regretted this decision pretty much instantly. They were afraid, they were anxious. They saw their naked bodies and found them disgusting, and they gathered leaves and made clothes, and they tried to hide their shame. And when God found out about it, he did not send Adam and Eve to hell. He said, "You will be out of the garden. You will have to leave the garden, and you will have to till your own land, and you will have to do some things in a very broken, hard to live in world. But I have not abandoned you. I have not forsaken you. You shall be saved." And so Adam and Eve, essentially humanity, left the Garden of Eden. But God never abandoned them. He watched over them. He watched over their children. He watched over their children's children. Eventually, an ancient world we have very little knowledge of was destroyed by a great flood, the flood in which Noah saved many souls of the animals. This world was destroyed because it was so twisted and corrupted and full of pain and suffering that it essentially had to end. We don't get a lot of information about why the world was so bad, but it did get to a point like that where it was so bad it had to be reset. So essentially, Noah was the beginning of reset humanity. And he had kids, and his kids had kids, and his kids had kids. And eventually, man is scattered across the face of the earth with many different languages. And God chooses one person, Abraham, to be one of the many ancestors of the Savior of the world. He chooses Abraham, and he says Abraham will become a mighty nation. Abraham has a son, Isaac, whom, throughout a period of waiting for Isaac for, decades, essentially, and knowing that Isaac would become the father of a nation himself, knew that story that you always complain about was a test. He sort of knew it, and the New Testament explicitly states that he knew it was a test. Then Isaac had kids. He had Jacob. Jacob had kids. He had 12 kids. 12 patriarchs. One of the 12 patriarchs was Joseph, and his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. And then a famine comes in, so Jacob and his family essentially have to move to Egypt and be reconciled with Joseph. And so then the Israelites spend a lot of time in Egypt, but become slaves to the Egyptians. So God raises up Moses to save the Israelites who are now living in Egypt. And God is leading them to the promised land. But of their own free will, they say they do not want to go into the promised land because they're afraid of the people that live in the promised land. They're afraid of the other people that lived in the promised land. The Canaanites, these terrifying cultures that were based on child sacrifice and sexual immorality. They said they don't want to go into the promised land because they don't want to deal with the Canaanites. So that generation wandered around in the desert for a long time, and then the next generation got to go into the promised land. And when they were in the promised land, they were set up a series of judges. This is where you get stories about characters like Deborah and Gideon and Samson. After the time of judges, Israel demands a king. And because they demanded something of the Lord chose, of his own free will, to give them a king. He gives them Saul. Saul turns out to not be a great king. So a new king is appointed. This would be David. This is the same David that killed Goliath. David becomes king. David's son Solomon becomes king, and Solomon builds a massive temple for the Lord to live in. But then after Solomon were Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and the kingdom of Israel split into two nations, Israel and Judah. After a long series of kings, Israel is conquered by Assyria. Assyria is conquered by Babylon, and Judah is conquered by Babylon. Now in Babylon, God has still not abandoned his people. His people were sort of allowed to be taken by these conquering nations because they forgot about God and turned to the idols of the Canaanites. And that's sort of why they went to exile. But God still didn't abandon them. He watched over them. He made sure that wherever they were in the world, whether it be Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome, he made sure that the Jewish people were always safe. He made sure that there was always a way out for them. That if they just called on the name of the Lord, they would be saved. The book of Daniel was written during the time of exile. It's one of my favorite books. It actually has a prophecy that counts to the exact day Jesus would be on the earth. Which is interesting. I could tell you about it if you ask about it. And eventually, Judah returns from exile. They return to the promised land. They rebuild the city and the temple. And they wait for a king that God has promised throughout the entire Bible, the Messiah. God promised the Messiah from the book of Genesis, the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. A king from the line of David, whose throne would be forever. This was the Messiah. And there are subtle clues in the Old Testament if you look at it. The Messiah could be none other than God himself. The types of things that the Messiah would do, the names he is given, the mighty God, everlasting Father. These are names that you can only give to God, and yet the Messiah holds them. And it's not like the plurality of persons was made up for the New Testament. The Spirit of the Lord was all throughout the Old Testament, with the prophets, empowering them to do great things. The Word of the Lord was there. The angel which carried his name. You look back in the Old Testament and you will see that God was always a Trinity. God always had a plurality of persons. And that makes sense, right? The primordial nature is love. The eternal nature is love. Love between the persons of an eternal family. And that's why in modern times we use this familial language. We use the term father and son because he's a family. And he is one. Reading the Bible helped me to understand that sin is not a lightweight thing. Sin is a very heavy thing. Sin is a big deal. Even the smallest sin can sort of butterfly effect into a massive, massive tragedy. And I see this in the Bible. I see that David lusted after his neighbor's wife. David could not help himself from looking at his neighbor's wife. But he was looking at his neighbor's wife without her consent, and even beyond that, he eventually ended up having an affair with Uriah's wife, and then when she got pregnant, he wanted to hide the sin from Uriah, so he sent Uriah to die in war. He placed him in a position of battle where he knew he would die. And so, lust led to adultery, which led to murder. And beyond that, because of this sin, David's own family fell apart. Many of his wives left him for other men, and his son raped his daughter because, in his son's eyes, this was what was right. This was what his dad was doing. His dad was having relations with taboo women, and so when in the eyes of David's son, I mean, like, surely that's fair game. And so it led to other people's sins. Not only the sins of David, but the sins of his kids. Eventually, David had to fight his own kid. It's also worth mentioning that one of the biggest atheist complaints about the Bible is whenever a biblical protagonist does something wrong. You have many examples of Bible protagonists doing things wrong in the Bible, but I think the atheists fail to realize that this is the point. This is the point of these stories. These stories weren't written to write the heroes of this ancient nation as these noble heroes who could do no wrong. No. These documents were written so that we would know their failures, that we would know their failings and their follies. These were written so that we would know to keep ourselves humble and to not stumble in sins ourselves. That even the greatest, most religious people in the world can be the worst sinners on earth. And I mean, you name me a Bible protagonist's sin, you name me any single one, and you're never able to show me where God condones the behavior, or he commands it, or he approves of it. You mention all these failings of Bible protagonists, and you never provide the slightest shred of evidence that God is okay with any of it. And
I'd say one of the biggest sins in the Bible, the death of Christ, the people who got together and plotted to kill Christ. They were the religious leaders. They were they were devout practicers of the religion, but they couldn't recognize their own Messiah. They couldn't recognize their own God. And so they rejected their own God in a very violent way. So it came time for the king to appear, the Messiah which God has promised through thousands of prophecies. He was not born in a palace, he was born in a manger. He was born where the animals feed on hay. A few kings came to see his birth. He grew up. When he was an adult, one of the very first things he did was he went into the Jordan River, and God put his sign of approval upon him. The Father placed the Holy Spirit over the Son, in a great event with many witnesses, one of which being John the Baptizer. And then Jesus went out into the world, and he faced the trials that we as men face. The devil offered Jesus everything everything the devil offers us. Everything the devil offers us, he tried to offer to Jesus. He offered power. And Jesus said, no. Jesus said he already had power. He already had power because he was the Son of the Father. He was the second person of the Trinity. And so Jesus rejected the devil's game and went out into the world. He proved he was the Messiah. He performed miracles, fulfilled prophecies, and offered wisdom that even the religious leaders didn't have. In a sense, he gave people the opportunity to see that he was the Messiah. He would ask his followers, "Who do you say that I am?" And his followers would say, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus said, "Yes. The Holy Spirit has revealed to you that Jesus is the Messiah." The religious leaders didn't like this. They didn't like the things that Jesus was preaching. They didn't like any of it. The religious leaders had a high position of authority with many riches. They were sort of on a class of their own. They were a class above the poor, and the poor were the outcasts. And Jesus went to the outcasts just like he went to me. And he healed the outcasts just like he healed me. As of this day, I don't have to do rituals whenever I hear noises anymore. They still sound really sharp and annoying sometimes, but like the rituals I had to do as a kid, I just don't have them anymore. And because they hated Jesus, they blasphemed him. They killed him. And now I'm living in a world where people blaspheme Jesus. People hate Jesus. People mock him and ridicule him. And he never did anything wrong to them. They just do it because, well, if he's fake, you won't feel it. And they fail to realize the distinct possibility that He might be real. I never really had hostility towards Christianity. I just didn't actively believe it for a time. As of today, I'd say Christianity is the only thing I'm really certain in. With my autism, a lot of stuff is still confusing to me. I don't understand how people are able to go out into the world and make friends and find spouses and stuff like that. I don't understand how people are able to apply for jobs or anything. The only thing I understand is that God created me. My Father created me. The Holy Spirit is guiding me. And the Son died for me. I can trust God because He's never proven Himself to be a liar. Everyone I love, everyone I know, apart from God, has lied to me at some point in my life. But God has never lied to me. False prophets coming in God's name lied to me, or claiming to come in God's name, I should say. My family has lied to me to try and keep me calm at certain moments of my life. I don't think there's a single thing God has said that's false. I can't find one. I read the Bible, and I can't find a single word God says that's incorrect. Christians will lie to you, but God won't. Christians will confuse you, but God offers understanding and wisdom. And in hindsight, looking back, a lot of things that were mysteries to me should have been obvious. Like, when other kids call me out in a sport, they're not trying to insult me. That's just a factual statement. I have lost the challenge that the gym teacher has set before me. When I look back at all the moments where people were trying to help me and I thought they were just trying to mess with what I had going on, should have realized that they were just trying to help and just were a little too intrusive sometimes. God offers understanding, but I often fall back into my worldly way of thinking. The last 4 years of high school were some of the best years of my life. Particularly the last two, 2018 and 2019. Those were some of the best years of my life. Now, I've kind of entered into a new era of my life. I'm not used to being an adult. Even 5 years into being an adult, I'm still not used to it. I should be, but I'm not. I still don't know what I'm doing, but I should. But even throughout all of this, God has given me the strength to get through it. Now, I do think part of the adult experience is that I need to make some decisions for myself. I can't be waiting around for other people to make decisions for me like I did when I was a kid. As an adult, I want to just wait for God to give me the answers, but I know that the way of adults is that we're supposed to just go and make choices. We're supposed to go and find paths and know that God will be with us throughout every step of the way. And in a sense, I don't want to be an adult. I want to just remain a child of God. But even as a 23-year-old at this point, I'm still a child of God. My grandma and grandpa didn't kick me out of the house. My mom didn't kick me out of the house. And although these places are a lot harder to navigate now that I'm 20 years old and not 18, 16, whatever, I know God won't kick me out of his house either. God is amazing. And I hope other people can come to understand that. Even if not, I'm hoping they can see what belief in God has done for this world. I'm never alone. And under the atheistic worldview, you can very well look at someone with no friends and say no one loves them. But under a Christian worldview, saying no one loves you is straight up blasphemy. God loves me. And he loves you too.